July 1883. Abilene, Kansas, the train huffed out of the station in a cloud of steam and coal smoke, leaving behind a thin woman on a weather-beaten bench, her gloved hands folded tight in her lap. Her suitcase rested beside her boots, scuffed and heavy. She did not look up when the engine shrieked away. She just sat there, back straight, lips pale, as if she had nowhere left to go. Ford Callahan had come to town for horseshoes and coffee. He never expected to find a woman like her at the depot alone, quiet and stiff like she had been holding herself together too long. The kind of posture folks take when they got no one left to lean on. He slowed near the bench, one hand resting on the leather strap across his chest. "You waiting on someone, miss?" She looked up then. Her eyes were the color of a storm rolling in a kind of gray that held too much in it. She blinked once, then shook her head. "No," Ford nodded slowly. "You going somewhere?" "No," her voice caught. "Not anymore." He looked at her trunk again. The initials AJ were stitched into the side in faded thread. "You got a name, Aveline," she said. "Aveline James." There was something in the way she said it, like she had not spoken it aloud in a while. Ford tipped his hat. "Ford Callahan." She nodded, polite but guarded. "You hungry?" he asked. "There's a cookhouse down the road that serves a fair stew." "I am not looking for company." "I did not offer myself," Ford said, a hint of a smile flickering. "Just stew." Aveline looked down at her gloves. "I do not have any money left." Ford bent and picked up her trunk without waiting. "Then it is on me." Her eyes widened. "You do not know me." He started walking. "No, but I will." She hesitated. Then she stood and followed without another word. They ate on the back porch of the cookhouse, where the breeze stirred the heat off the land. Aveline picked at her food like she was not used to eating regular. Ford did not pry, but he watched. After the meal, he carried her trunk to his horse wagon without asking. She stood on the dirt road, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. "I never said I was going anywhere with you." "You do not have anywhere else to go," Ford said, "or you would not have let me feed you." She flinched. "Where are you going?" "Back to my place, north of town." "It is quiet out there." "You live alone?" He nodded. "Just me and the land." She looked down the road, then back to him. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I saw you sitting alone at the depot," he said, "and I could not leave you there." Aveline stared at him a long time. Then she stepped toward his wagon and climbed in. They rode in silence through the open country, past wheat fields and sun-baked fences. The sky stretched wide, gold and violet with the sinking sun. Her trunk rattled in the back. She asked nothing. He said little. But in the quiet, something settled between them, some small, new thing neither could name yet. When they reached his homestead, she took in the house with its stone chimney and front porch. Not much, but clean, cared for. "I will sleep in the barn," she said. "No," Ford answered. "You will take the room with the window that faces east," she frowned. "That is your room. I want you to have it." Her shoulders pulled back, but her voice softened. "I do not need charity." "This is not charity," he said. "It is a beginning." That night, Aveline stood in the doorway of the east-facing room looking out at the moonlit prairie. She held her arms close as if she still felt the weight of something. Ford passed by in the hall and paused. "You need anything?" She looked over at him. "I do not know how to be here." "You do not have to know," he said gently. "Just rest." She nodded once. He walked away. Aveline did not sleep right away. She lay in the clean bed, listening to the wind, to the stillness. Somewhere in the dark, something inside her began to loosen. The next morning she rose early. She found Ford already outside, chopping wood. He looked up when she stepped onto the porch. "I can help," she said. "You do not have to." "I want to." He handed her a smaller axe without a word. She worked beside him. They did not talk much. But when he glanced at her, sweat on her brow, jaw set firm, he felt something shift in his chest. That night, she made cornbread from what she found in his pantry. It came out dry, but he ate every bite. They sat on the porch afterward, watching the stars. "You said this was a beginning," she said at last. "What did you mean?" Ford looked over at her. "I meant maybe you could stay, for good." Her lips parted, but she said nothing. He leaned forward just a little. "You do not have to answer now. I just want you to know there is room here. For you." She sat quiet a while, then she said softly, "I left St. Louis 3 weeks ago. I was supposed to go to Denver, to marry a man I had never met." Ford's jaw tightened. "He stopped writing once I reached Kansas. Found someone else, I suppose. I had nothing left, so I just sat at that depot." Ford leaned back, his arms across his chest. "You are not someone a man should throw away." She looked at him. "You do not know me. I know enough." Her eyes searched his face. "You really want me here? I already took your trunk off that platform," he said. "And I already called you mine in my head." She blinked. "What?" "I called you my Forevermore," he said, voice low. "The second I saw you sitting there." Her breath caught. "I mean to prove it," he added. "If you will let me." Aveline did not answer right away. But she did not walk inside either. She just sat there beside him, closer than before, her hand resting on the rough wood of the porch rail, not far from his. And when the wind stirred again, neither of them moved. By the end of that week, Aveline had stitched curtains for the kitchen window out of old flour sacks she found folded in a crate beneath the bed. Ford noticed them when the morning light poured through, softened now, and touched the worn table where he drank his coffee. He didn't say anything, just took his cup outside and worked down the fence row. But when she brought him cornbread wrapped in a cloth at midday, he looked at her longer than usual. "You always know how to make things steadier," he said, wiping his hands on his trousers. "I like quiet corners," she answered. "They give me room to breathe." Ford nodded, then passed her the tin of nails without a word. She stayed a while, holding a post steady while he hammered. They didn't speak again until the work was done. That evening, a wagon creaked down the road and stopped at the gate. Ford squinted toward it, then walked out with his rifle resting loosely across his arm. Aveline stood in the doorway, one hand braced against the frame, watching. A man with a thick gray beard and a crooked arm stepped down, holding a folded paper. "Letter came for you," he said. "Thought it best to bring it myself." "I don't get many of those," Ford said, taking the envelope and nodding his thanks. The man tilted his head toward the house. "Heard you had someone staying." Aveline stepped back from view. Ford didn't look away. "She's not passing through." The man's brow lifted. "Didn't know you took to company." "Wasn't looking to," Ford said. "But she came." The man nodded once, handed over the letter and climbed back into the wagon. Dust rose behind him as he drove off. Ford didn't open the envelope until he was sitting at the kitchen table, boots still dusty. Aveline stood by the hearth, her hands still. "Bad news?" she asked. "My brother's boy broke his leg out in Ellsworth." Ford folded the letter. "They've got no doctor close. He's asking if I can come help mend a roof before the rain hits." She walked over and reached for the letter. He passed it to her. "How far is it?" she asked after reading. 2 days if I ride steady." She touched the corner of the page. "When will you go?" "Tomorrow." He didn't say he didn't want to leave her. He didn't say he'd never left someone behind who mattered. But she seemed to understand. "I'll keep the stove warm," she said, handing back the letter. Ford hesitated, then reached for her hand. Her fingers were roughened from work, but they fit against his like they belonged there. He left at first light, saddle packed with bread and apples she'd wrapped in cloth. She stood in the doorway again, this time not hiding. He didn't say goodbye. He just touched the brim of his hat and rode out. 3 days passed. She mended a split in the porch rail, fed the hens, and wrote letters she never intended to send. On the fourth morning, she heard hooves and stepped outside before he reached the gate. He looked tired. His shirt was streaked with travel and there was a gash above his brow. "What happened?" she asked, already moving toward him. "Roof beam slipped," he said. "Nothing worth fussing." She took his hand and led him inside without another word. She cleaned the wound with boiled water and stitched it with a needle so fine he barely felt it. Afterward, he rested in the chair by the hearth while she sat across from him, her skirt brushing the floor. "You didn't leave," he said quietly. "I said I'd keep the stove warm," he nodded, gaze steady on hers. "I kept thinking about the curtains." She lowered her eyes. "They're nothing special. They made the house feel like it had a heartbeat." She looked up again, something shifting in her face. "I want you to stay," he said. "I know. I mean always." Her voice was barely a whisper. "I know that too," he leaned forward. "Then say it." Her fingers curled around the arm of the chair. "I want to stay." He reached across the space between them and took her hand, not hurried, not uncertain, just sure. Outside, the wind moved through the prairie grass, and the sun poured through flour sack curtains onto the floor where their shadows met. The first frost came early that October, curling the edges of the prairie grass and dusting the eaves of the house in a thin, white hush. Aveline stood at the edge of the pasture with Ford's coat drawn over her shoulders, watching steam rise from the horse's breath as they paced near the fence. She had taken to waking before he did, always just long enough to feel the land alone, as if to test her place in it. Ford came up behind her quietly, his steps soft on the frozen dirt. "You'll draw the cold standing out here like that." She didn't turn. "I used to dream about snow when I was a child. I thought it meant everything would be clean again." He stepped beside her. "And now, I think it just means everything's still moving forward, whether we're ready or not." Ford rubbed the back of his neck, his fingers stiff from the cold. "The creek's low. I'll have to dig the channel deeper before it ices over." She looked at him then. "You always worked this land alone, since my father passed. My brother went east. I stayed." She studied the horizon where the trees stood bare and black against the silver sky. "You ever think of leaving?" Ford shook his head. "This place knows me. I wouldn't know how to be somewhere else." They walked back toward the house together, the frost crunching beneath their boots. Inside, the fire had burned low, and Aveline crouched to feed it split wood from the basket. Her hands moved without hesitation now, practiced and sure. After breakfast, Ford hitched the wagon and lifted a broken gate into the back. "I'll stop at the mill for new hinges. Might be late." Aveline wiped her hands on her skirt. "I'll set aside supper." He paused, then nodded once. "There's a letter in the drawer from my brother's wife. She writes better than he does, might give you something to read." She opened the drawer after he left. The letter was folded neat with a pressed violet tucked inside. The words were plain, but kind. His sister-in-law spoke of her boys, of the drought, of how she hoped Ford might come east for Christmas just once. Aveline ran her thumb over the pressed flower, then set it carefully back where she found it. Later, she took the wash out to the line. Wind tugged at the linens and she pinned them quickly, her fingers red with cold. A neighbor woman rode up slow on a mule, her bonnet tied tight under her chin. "You're Callahan's girl?" the woman asked. Aveline nodded. "He's not much for talking." "No," Aveline agreed. The woman eyed the house. "Looks better than it did last year. He's kept it up." The woman tilted her head. "You staying on?" Aveline glanced at the line of laundry, at the smoke rising from the chimney. "I've unpacked." That night, Ford came in with his collar turned up against the wind and his hands full of iron. He set the hinges on the table and looked at her. "You read it?" he asked. "I did." He pulled off his coat and hung it by the door. "You think I should go back there? I think they miss you." He leaned against the table. "And what about you?" She set the stew pot on the stove and turned to face him fully. "I won't stop you, but I won't follow either." His jaw tightened, then eased. "I wasn't asking you to." She stepped closer. "I've had enough of chasing things that don't stay." He reached for her hand, not roughly but with weight. "I never wanted to be followed. I just want someone to stand beside me." Aveline looked up at him, her voice steady. "Then don't go." Ford exhaled slow, like he'd been holding that breath a long time. "I won't. Not if you want me here." She didn't answer with words. She stepped into him, wrapped her arms around his waist, and rested her head against his chest. He held her close, his chin brushing the crown of her head, and the wind outside rattled the window panes but didn't touch them. Later, they sat at the table with bear plates between them, the fire warm on their backs. Ford reached for the hinges. "I'll fix the gate tomorrow," he said. Aveline folded her hands. "No rush. It's not going anywhere." He looked at her, something quiet and certain in his eyes. "Neither are we." The days shortened into November, and the wind shifted colder, brushing the land with a dry bite that carried the scent of smoke from distant fields. Aveline stood at the table, rolling out dough with the heel of her hand. The flour clung to her knuckles, and the scent of lard and salt rose faint in the warm air of the kitchen. Ford sat by the window, oiling the leather of his saddle, the rhythm of his cloth slow and even. "You ever lived through a Kansas winter?" he asked, not looking up. "No," she said. "Closest I came was a boarding house in Hannibal. The roof leaked and the stove smoked. We all slept in our clothes." Ford set the saddle aside. "This roof holds, but it gets quiet out here." "Real quiet." Aveline dusted her hands. "I'm not afraid of quiet." He nodded once and picked up the girth strap. "Some folks are. Makes them feel like the world's gone hollow." She looked at him, the lines beside his eyes catching in the lamplight. "You ever think that about yourself?" "I did," he said. "For a long while. Before." Outside, the wind rattled the porch slats and the chickens made low, uneasy sounds in the coop. Aveline crossed to the door and fastened the latch. "You've been sleeping less," she said when she turned back. He straightened in his chair. "How would you know that? I hear you get up at night. The kettle shifts when you set it down." Ford didn't answer at first. Then he stood and poured water into the basin, washing the oil from his hands. "Sometimes I still think I'll wake up and find the house empty again," he said. "You won't," she said quietly. He dried his hands and leaned back against the counter. "You thought about what you want come spring?" Aveline's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "There's space for a garden," he said. "And the south pasture's never been cleared. Could build a second structure, something with a loft." She crossed the floor slowly, smoothing her skirt down as she walked. "You thinking of putting me out there?" He looked up, startled. "No. I'm thinking of building something for both of us. Something that starts with us, not just you fitting into what I already had." She touched the edge of the basin, her voice low. "I've never had someone ask what I wanted." "Not really. I'm asking now." She looked up at him, and something in her eyes trembled but didn't break. "I want to plant lavender," she said, "and maybe paint the walls something other than smoke gray. And I want to wake up knowing the day belongs to us, not someone else's plan." Ford stepped closer. "Then we'll do that." She reached for his hand and he let her, his fingers curling around hers with purpose. Later that week they rode out to the south pasture together. The grass there grew wild and tough, with brambles at the edges and burrows dug deep by wind and prairie dogs. Ford tied the horses near the fence and handed her the surveyor's rod. "You mark what you want," he said. "Where you think the windows should face." Aveline walked the space, her boots crunching over frost-hardened weeds. She paused near the slope of a low rise and pointed. "There," she said, "so we can see the morning come." Ford pressed the toe of his boot into the earth. "It'll take time." "I've got time," she said. They worked through the morning, staking the corners and clearing brush. She didn't ask him to stop when her palms blistered. He didn't offer to do it alone. They broke bread beside the fence, sharing water from a tin cup, and when he leaned back on his elbows, she sat beside him, her shoulder warm against his sleeve. "You ever think about children?" she asked after a while. He turned his head, the brim of his hat tilted low. "Sometimes. Not before. But lately." She plucked a twig from the ground and twisted it between her fingers. "I don't know if I can." "I didn't ask you because of that," he said. "I know." He reached over and took the twig from her, set it aside. "I asked because I look at you and see the rest of my life. And I wonder what else we might build." Aveline looked down at his hand on hers. "If we can make space for lavender and paint, we can make space for whatever comes." He kissed her then, slow and certain, his hand rising to her cheek, rough thumb brushing the edge of her jaw. She leaned into it, not trembling this time, but solid. That night, they didn't return to the house until the stars had come out. The fire had gone to embers, and they lit the lamp together. She pulled the quilt from the chair and spread it across their bed, and when he lay down beside her, neither of them reached for distance. The wind howled once across the roof, but the walls held. And when morning came, it touched both their faces with the same quiet promise. By late December, the ground had hardened beneath a crust of snow, and the air held the kind of stillness that made every sound carry farther than it should. Aveline stood at the hearth, pinning a strip of calico across the window frame to keep out the draft. Ford was outside hauling the last of the chopped wood to the lean-to, his coat dusted with patches of frost, breath visible as he moved when he came in. His boots left damp marks on the floorboards. He set the bundle of kindling inside the box and pulled off his gloves, flexing the fingers slowly. "Got word from the Thompsons," he said, hanging his coat by the door. "They're headed to town for the christening of that new church. Asked if we'd come." Aveline didn't look up from the window. "You want to?" He stepped beside her, brushing a stray thread from her sleeve. "I think we ought to be seen. Folks still carry questions." She nodded once. "Then we'll go." They rode in silence the next morning, wrapped in wool and oilskin, the wagon creaking over rutted tracks. Abilene looked different with the snow quieter, the edges softened. Townsfolk nodded as they passed, some tipping hats, others watching from windows, their expressions unreadable. Inside the church, the wood still smelled fresh, the pews narrow and unvarnished, the air full of breath and hymns. Aveline sat beside Ford, hands folded in her lap. When the preacher called for blessings over the new altar, Ford reached over and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers as though it was a habit he'd had for years. Afterward, they lingered near the steps while the congregation filtered out. A woman in a dark blue shawl approached Ford's sister-in-law, Sarah, her face wind-chapped and kind. "You look well," she said, reaching for Aveline's hands. Aveline nodded. "You too." Sarah glanced at Ford. "Your brother's still hoping you'll come east for a visit." "I'm needed here," he said. Sarah's gaze moved between them. "I can see that." She leaned in closer, voice lower. "I'm glad he found someone who makes the world sit still." Aveline watched her walk away, the shawl trailing behind her like a shadow. That night, back at the homestead, Ford lit the oil lamp and poured hot water into the basin while Aveline unwrapped the parcel Sarah had handed her 2 jars of blackberry preserves and a bundle of wool yarn dyed cedar red. "She said you used to carve," Aveline said. Ford wiped his hands dry. "Long time ago." "Why'd you stop?" He turned the towel over in his hands. "Didn't feel right putting time into something that didn't serve a purpose." She held up the yarn. "Would you make me a knitting frame?" He looked at her carefully. "You planning on staying long enough to need one?" "I already have," she said. He stepped forward, reached out, and touched the side of her neck. "Then I will." In the following weeks, the south pasture structure began to take shape. Not large, but sturdy, with a sloped roof and wide eaves drawn from Aveline's sketches. Ford sawed and hammered while she fetched nails and smoothed planks with a rasp until her knuckles turned raw. When the wind picked up, they worked inside, her seated near the stove stitching curtains, him bent over the frame of a rocking chair he'd started without telling her. By early February, the shingles were laid. The walls had been whitewashed. The bed was built from pine Ford had milled himself. Aveline ran her hand across the posts, her eyes soft. "You did all this with your own hands," she said. He looked at her from where he sat, finished sanding the chair. "Not alone." She stepped closer. "Tell me the truth. When you first saw me, did you pity me?" Ford set down the sanding cloth. "I saw someone who'd been left behind, but I didn't pity you." "Then why?" "Because you were still upright, still breathing. Because you hadn't turned bitter. I never pitied that. I admired it." She crouched beside him, folding her skirt neatly. "I don't want to keep waiting for the other shoe to drop. I want to live like this is real." He leaned in, his forehead against hers. "It is." They married in early March, not in town, but beneath the cottonwood at the edge of the pasture, where the land sloped just enough to catch the sun. Sarah came from Ellsworth, along with her boys. The Thompsons brought a jar of pickled beets. The preacher kept it brief. Aveline wore a dress she'd sewn from the bolt of muslin Ford had given her weeks before, the hem stitched with lavender thread. After the vows, Ford took her hand and didn't let go. They ate stew and cornbread on the porch, the sky turning the color of rust and fire as the day slipped toward dusk. When the guests had gone and the lanterns were lit inside, Ford led her into the new house. It smelled of pine and hearth smoke, and the warmth from the fire had already soaked into the walls. He helped her out of her shawl and hung it by the door. She turned to him, her hands resting against his chest. "We built this together," she said. He nodded. "And everything that comes next." She kissed him then, slow and deep, her hands no longer tentative. The years between their former lives and this moment fell away, and what remained was real, solid, chosen. They lay in the bed he'd carved, the quilt she'd stitched pulled high, and when the wind howled outside, it passed over the roof without sound. They spoke little, their words unnecessary now. What was between them had grown from silence and labor, from trust built one moment at a time. In the months that followed, the lavender took root along the side of the house. The knitting frame stood beneath the east window, half-finished socks hanging from the pegs. The chair Ford built rocked gently each evening as Aveline sat with her sewing, his hand resting on her knee. By summer the garden bloomed thick with beans and squash. The townsfolk no longer asked questions when they rode in for supplies, and when Sarah wrote, she signed the letter, "To you both." One evening, beneath a harvest sky, Ford leaned back against the porch post, watching the chickens settle. Aveline sat beside him, her hair loose for once, her hands folded in her lap. "I never thought I'd have this," she said. He looked at her, the lines at the corners of his mouth deepening as he smiled. "You have me, and I'm enough. You're everything." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat that way until the stars opened above them, wide and sure, and nothing more needed to be said.